Hey, welcome, Francisco. Thanks so much for spending some time with me and the audience here today. I'll just do a very quick introduction of myself and then hand it over to you, and then perhaps we can have a little bit of discussion about some of your recent thoughts in this space. But to kick it
Nice.
off, Joe Levy, CEO of Uplevel, founded this business about 5 or 6 years ago to really focus on, I think, this emerging space of engineering effectiveness and productivity. Was an engineer a long time ago and turned into more of a business person and saw this opportunity just seem to rise more and more. But that's my story very quickly. Why don't you give the audience here a little bit of introduction? Would love to know your background, a bit about how you got into engineering management as well, and tell us about the work you're doing now.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Joe, and thanks for having me. So, Francisco, I'm a VP of engineering at Braze in New York. I've been working in software for like a while, like since the beginning of my career, but like I think in very different ways. I kind of like started as a consultant, and and in consulting, a lot of what I did was, of course, being an engineer, like and writing code and kind of helping teams deliver work and projects, but also like a lot of our intention was to make software teams work better. So like though we had this idea of like what are process tools and technologies that will help with that, and we'll try to help our customers with that. So and I did that for a while, for like 7 years, and I've seen like many teams, small, large, big companies, small companies, like startups and different and kind of as a consultant you see a lot of failure modes, I guess, because most of the people that hire consultants are teams that are not they're struggling to like figure out themselves. After that, I started my own company, like and had a startup for like 6 years. So I was kind of like managing my own team, and then most recently in the past like 5 6 years got really into like this maybe more formal engineering leadership industry, where like I became a senior manager at a company, and then director, and then now VP. From the beginning of my career, I think my main focus has continued to be like how to make teams work better, and like how to make teams, my software teams in particular, kind of work better and be more productive and more efficient. And I continue to do that like in the current role.
That's a great segue. I was going to ask you, I think some of the genesis of this conversation, I really enjoy your posts on Medium. And it looks like you generally blog a lot about that and enjoy talking about it. What I always love people who do it and enjoy writing about it. I find that's an interesting thing that, frankly, with a lot of technical leaders, I see less of. Tell me about why you enjoy writing, how that helps you kind of in your job, and what topics you find most fun to write about.
Thanks for that. Thanks for the readership. But like writing in general has been, I've been doing it for a while on and off, and I started more recently to be more consistent with it. But like it's always been a way to like crystallize thoughts. So like
Mm.
observations, and I think that's kind of how it's been useful as well for me. Is just like think, okay, like I'm seeing this, I'm thinking about it, but I can't really explain yet. So now if I write it, I now can explain. And that's kind of like how I think about that and how I thought about that all the time. In terms of what I write about, the thing is, going back to like what I said about my career, I think as a consultant, you see a lot of like failure modes. And I think the interesting part of software in the software industry for me is that like a lot of the failure happens not for the reasons that people talk about a lot. We are very centered in technology and like the tools and the code and the efficiency and the performance of software, which is of course all important characteristics. But then when you see teams struggling, I don't know, I like to say that I've never seen a team fail because the engineers didn't know how to write the correct code, but I've seen like many teams struggle because they didn't communicate well, they didn't work well together, they didn't think about like the project, how to frame the project or the work they're doing well. And that was like what I did as consultant. It's kind of help with that. When I kind of like then went into like this more recent phase of my career, looking at like being a senior manager and director, there's been a huge movement into like the creation and evolution of engineering management in software and technology, which is, I think, has been great. And I think we have like all these like I think people don't realize, but the idea of an engineer managing a team is not that old. You still see a lot of like managers coming into this role with like a lot of technical context and a lot of like technical preparation and context about like the technology. but without much preparation of context on like the rest of like how is
Mm.
this team supposed to work and how do I make this team efficient. So that's why I try to write about. It's kind of like the non-technology part of software teams and how to kind of like get that, how to like align that and make teams effective and create environments where engineers can succeed. What I found is that like the long-term accumulation of documents has helped me a lot in my career because I can because the problems are the same, like, not the same, but they're similar, right? We're still talking about the same problems over and over again of like how teams work. Now I can refer other people to it, or I can refer
Yeah.
myself to this. Oh yeah, I'm seeing this problem again, and guess what? I wrote about it 2 years ago, and that has helped me be more efficient because I can say, look, I don't need to. Sometimes I'm working, I'm like helping other managers. Like I don't need to explain this idea to you like in this call. I can like point you to this document that I wrote that is exactly
Yeah.
about this problem.
Yeah. Well, it's really impressive just to meet someone who takes that discipline and time out of your busy job and life to do that. So that's just really great to hear. One of your recent posts where you said, any engineering leader that has been around longer than 5 seconds has heard the age old, what's taking so long? I worked at Microsoft during the Windows, it was XP and then Vista, and it was, we had bottomless resources of the most senior talent in the world, and it was still years and years delayed, and no one could seem to give a good answer to the question, and it's a very hard question to answer. Um, Curious, how many times it's been asked to you, how many times you ask it, what your just thoughts are on that as a question when it is seems like this just unbelievable age old frustrating question.
I think like my perspective is, and maybe this is a spicy perspective, but it's kind of is like twofold. I do ask that question. I don't think I do that often because I think like the teams that I work with, I am quite focused in how they work. So I expect that if the problem, if a problem happens, I'll notice before. I think like and like there'll be like better ways to solve it. Which kind of goes to the second point of my answer is just like if you're hearing that question, it's kind of something went wrong like maybe a long time ago. Like it's not like that your team is delayed, but maybe the problem is like how did you shape this project? How did your team shape this project so that it could be delayed? Or how have you communicated or how have you released, how have you like left a gap in saying like, okay, we're gonna release everything at the end and the end never comes, right? Like so I think like as a leader, the way I think about it and the way I talk to managers is just like your job is to mitigate risk, right? Like it's just like every project, software has a lot of risk embedded in it for the reasons that we all know. Like things are complex, like the complexity of like some areas explode. You might like you think like, oh, this is gonna be take me a day, and it's actually been 3 weeks, and it's just like that you're still trying to solve it. The business requirements is constantly changing, and like the even if you build the right thing might not work in the market, and so like you might not have anything that's useful in terms of like impact. So in that sense, like what you have to do is like mitigate the risk from day one, and the way you mitigate risk is just like the things that we mostly know is like iterative release, short feedback loops, consistent communication. My pet peeve with like the current literature about like software engineering and management goes around like, okay, how do you deal with problems? And I think like I'm like more interested in say like how do you avoid these problems to happen from the beginning.
It's great perspective. Let's say you are talking or someone's listening to this who's at a reasonably sized organization that's having that problem. All the people, the head of product, sales, marketing, whatever, is saying, hey, I thought we were supposed to get some set of features or release, last quarter. We need it to make our revenue. And, where is it? Why is it so late? And ignoring the very specific reason for that particular project, how would you coach leaders to try to shift the conversation so they're not getting those same questions again on the next project or the next project, whatever that is? How do you help
Yeah,
someone
I
shift
think
that
what you
organizational? thinking?
That's a great question. I have this friend who has a quote, a Twitter quote that says like, we know like all the evolution from I think software development in the past decades is like that we learn that continuous like iterative development, continuous feedback and short feedback loops and consistent communication are the things you have to do. Like, so I think as a leader, what you're doing is, I mean, one, shaping the work the way that you say, okay, is never a, you know, X months project. It is a 2 weeks effort to release something, and that is validated. And like, so you are like you're just like reducing, again, like going back to mitigating risk, is just like, if you have an initiative that's going to be like, 2 years, what is the 1 month version of that you can try to
Right.
do and start to get validation? So you're like, now you're risking a month, you're not risking 2 years, right? So I think that's one part of it. And then the other part is a lot of the engineering challenge with like companies and kind of like business is just like providing options, right? It's never about what you can or cannot do. It's about what are the trade-offs you can make in a situation. Because if you are a team that's always delivering iteratively, that you're always working on a complete solution, that you're always doing the minimal before you can get feedback, then what you're buying is like a lot of options. And I think that's kind of how I try to like run teams, right? It's saying like, if our scope changes tomorrow, we should be like, great, everything we've done is still valid. We're going to start in another direction. And like, that's great. Like, this is the trade-off. The trade-off is that we're not going to deliver this, we're going to deliver that. Like, I think a lot of times, like many times in my career as well, in terms of like, when you think about like crunch time and like projects that are just like against a deadline, a lot of times is understanding, okay, what is the value that needs to be delivered by the time, and then how you build a plan so you're sure that that value can be delivered. And there are options out there. What I tell managers is, if you do have a timeline, as long as you have always a product ready to be shipped, then like, you are not a bottleneck. Now the bottleneck is a business decision, right? If you can say, okay, we reached a timeline, we haven't delivered 100%, but we have 80% that's ready. So now, like, product leader or business leader, is your call. Like, do we release this and we go live with 80%, or we don't? Like, but like, engineering doesn't become the bottleneck of the decision. It's never the case. I think if you are in a case that you find yourself in a situation to say like, the product is not ready because we haven't integrated all the pieces, and so there's nothing to show at this point, and we need another like 3 months, like, that's a situation that has been created, right? It didn't have to be like that.
Okay, but let's play that out at scale. I think it's a really core point. You sort of joke like there wasn't a magic in it, but I think it is true. Like if you look over the past perhaps 2 decades of engineering work in general, it used to just be so kind of big monolith projects that, products built, 50-page
Yeah.
PRDs, and then engineering worked for the next year. And, if it was wrong, you didn't correct it till the next year. And now everything's, if we even plan next sprint, we really don't even do that till almost the end of the sprint. And we're sort of super agile and flexible. And let's say we do that really well. I was talking to another leader of some pretty big organizations, and he joked. He said, the problem with doing agile really well is you cross some sort of numeric threshold of people. In his mind, it was about 250. But whatever it is, let's just say a healthy 3-digit number. And then every day you wake up and there's at least one person doing completely the wrong thing, even if it's not, it's not with malintent. It's because you've created such an agile framework and the group's gotten big, and now it's really hard to make sure everyone's actually aligned to the right goals and the right work, so that everyone's working on the right thing. What are some ways you found to make sure that a bigger organization of folks, everyone is really aligned to the goals, is really working on what they should be working on?
I'll answer something else first, and then I'll go to your question directly. But I think, first of all, I don't disagree with this person, right? Yes, the large organization, the harder is going to be to manage it and be aligned. So that's one thing. The thing in the mentality is like, you are using trade-offs to minimize risk. So my approach is that like I minimize the risk of making a mistake, but I'm making a trade-off, which is maybe you underutilize some people or overutilize some people. Like that's there's no perfect solution, right? That's a conversation you have with engineers. Is just like we know, like I think like one of the things that if you really go to the extreme of agile and like iterative development, you create situations where like it's hard to get focused. It's hard for engineers to like be efficient individually, right? I have this conversation with engineers say like, well, we need to shape this work in a way that minimizes risk. So like in iterative perspective, in iterative fashion. And a lot of times the answer will be like, well, this is not the most efficient way to do it. And which I'll say like, yes, I know. That's like, we're not trying to be efficient. We're trying to minimize the risk. Right?
Right.
That's the whole point. Like I'm making a trade-off that I rather you are a bit inefficient, but we're not going to be here on like a Friday night and you'll be like, well, I have nothing to deliver. And instead we'll shape this work differently so that we're going to pay with some efficiency, but I have the belief that we're going to gain on the medium and long term because we're going to be like more adaptive.
Mm.
And given how, you know, how much things change in technology, I think being adaptive wins. I think now going back to your question of like, okay, what do you do in a large scale? I think maybe it's a non-answer, but I think it's like you never get to the large scale, right? I think like one of the challenges we talked a lot about, a lot of the consulting I did in my career, beginner career, like was on agile and helping people with iterative methodologies. 15 years ago, it was the question. It continues to be is like, how do you scale agile? How do you scale
Mm.
iterative methodology? And I think like the answer that I always gave is like, you don't. You just like you give autonomy, right? You say you align people on teams on goals, and then you give a certain level of autonomy. And of course, like the larger the group, you're going to have to shift that balance. Maybe there's going to be more direction and less autonomy, or more autonomy, less direction. But you keep those groups small in some sense, right? You create teams, you create divisions in your company, and those then can work in a more iterative fashion because they are like driving their own goals. Now there is the question then, oh, maybe there's going to be misalignment across that. And the answer is like, yes, there will be like 100%. But that's a trade-off. Right? You're saying like, well, I'm happy to pay for the misalignment and the kind of 10% or 20% of work that goes in the wrong direction because I believe the other 80% like
Yeah,
makes
there's a
sense.
benefit. It's such a simple but profound thought that like there's just a trade-off of noise and cost somewhere. And so
Yeah,
you will always have some problem. You're just trying to kind of keep it at rest. And I guess the way I would be curious what your thought on this is for the developers that are on that 80%, and I know it's never quite like what you said exactly, but like, the ones that you feel like the project's clear and they are able to execute well on their plans and sort of feel like it's good, that's great. But those ones that you kind of refer to when it's like, hey, we're going to have to shift direction here, or we're just going to have to pause while we figure something out, or there's going to be some noise or uncertainty. And I'm sure in your career you have heard from them like, hey, I don't know what I'm doing, or I'm conflicting with this, or there's some blocker to me getting my work done. How do you ensure at least the majority of the developers are feeling productive? And then when you hear blockers, what are you like, that's an acceptable blocker? That's fine. You don't know what you're supposed to be working on, or you're in a bunch of meetings, like whatever it is, for some sense of the organization, you believe that's okay. And you still have to convince them like that's an acceptable problem to, cope with for what we're dealing with.
I would hope that I think almost 100% of the people, to the max that you can, I guess, like it's never going to be 100%, like that people are delivering productive work. And that's like a leadership, I think, role of saying, like, okay, how we're aligning teams and engineers and like individuals in their growth path. Like, and we can talk about that, but like ultimately, like you should be able to say everyone is doing something that they can do. They're not going to be blocked by doing it. So I think having that perspective to like all the work that's been done, I think is important. If you are like the leader on the top of like 200 people, you're going to be, well, there's 80% that actually went the direction that we wanted. There was 20% that went the other direction. That wasn't what we wanted, but was still productive. Like, and in some senses, maybe you discover something that's even more, there's a chance that like, okay, actually it was productive because like it wasn't the plan, but it kind of like resulted in something good. But a lot of chances would be like, well, it wasn't the plan. Maybe that effort would have been better invested in other places, but that effort was still
Mm.
delivered something that was useful, right? If you look at a team nowadays, like in practice, they're going to be like, there's probably like OKRs or goals they're building. There's like maybe, 60, 70% of the work. There's like 30%. There's just like a lot of things like technology
Yeah.
improvements. There's innovation work. There's like issues, bugs, and stuff like that. And this like and this could be much more than 30% sometimes. So there's always a mix of investment. It's like a portfolio of investment, right? You have
Mm.
this capacity, you're trying to align this capacity towards specific goals. There's a loss in that. But the loss is not like, I think it's a loss on the whole, but it's not a loss on the individual level. I think those people are still hopefully doing things that are productive, they're getting results. It's just maybe not the priority number one that you had in your mind.
So it really is what you said before, which is the leadership problem, or what it sounds like is maybe the focus or that allocation is the leader's problem to solve, and the assumption is each person, for the most part, I mean, I'm sure there's exceptions, but is doing great work in their individual thing. It's the alignment to those goals that really is the leadership's issue.
Saying there's a leadership problem doesn't mean to say that it has to be a leadership initiative or decision, or like it has to come from leadership, right? As a team leader or organization leader, you should be aware, mindful, and act on where your efforts is going. Now, it doesn't mean you have to tell everyone what to do, right? You can be like that. Everyone is coming up with these plans, but you are aligning them. Like it could be that part of it is directed from the top, part from the bottom, and you mixing that. But I think the alignment is the leadership problem, and the focus of the leadership problem, right? Like it's just the result of that mix. But that still leaves space for like people, innovating and finding problems themselves and proposing solutions, and like all of that is a part of like the techniques, I guess, more like the practical techniques more than like the kind of philosophical thinking around it.
If we transpose that with what I'm sure you have seen all too much in your career, and I know everyone has, a common engineering leader has often come from just being a very talented dev, and they get promoted up, and they've patents and wizardry and all kinds of unbelievable tech prowess, but it doesn't necessarily translate to great leadership clarity with respect to focus and productivity and kind of the engineering of people and the engineering of processes and that kind of stuff is just very different. What type of advice, as a sort of closing to this interview, would you give to maybe a engineering leader who was recently promoted into the job, or perhaps doesn't have such a consultative, reflective type of background as you do, that is really struggling with this, right? Feels like they're getting asked why the project is late. The devs are all working on different things. There's lots of, distractions and lack of productivity or even understanding what productivity is. How do you help them materialize into the level of thinking you have here?
I do think that consulting, what the thing that gave me is that like as a consultant, you're always in the back foot, right? You're hired for a project that's probably not going well, and you're being like valued by almost by the time, like your company is being like paid by the day or whatever. So you have to consistently prove why you're there, right? Otherwise, this you could not be there anymore. Like, and so I think a lot of the focus that we had was just like consistently like minimize risk, communicate, make sure that like we are showing progress, and never be in a position that you are like in the back foot, right? It's just like you just like never put yourself in a position, you try to avoid the position that you cannot deliver.
Right.
In terms of like the advice, I think is that the items I keep talking to managers is like, one thing, understand your team's goals and try to as much as possible define that. So I think like not as a group of individuals, but like as a team, like why is your team your team? Why is it created? Who's like, what's this place in the organization, what it's trying to achieve? You can have think about that in a high level, but you can think about like in the short term, like in this next quarter, in this next month or whatever, like what is this team trying to achieve? And make sure you know that and that everyone in the team knows that. And the second part, I think, is like become an expert in your team's work. And that's like not saying because engineers will become managers, they're experts in the technology on the like maybe the most easy case is like an engineer in a team gets promoted to be the manager of that team, right? So they are now an expert on the technology of that work. They are also an expert of the engineer experience, right? Of saying like, okay, how I code and where I'm blocked and stuff like that. But I think what you have to become an expert is like the work end to end, like in saying, okay, well, from someone having an idea, or someone saying like we're gonna build something, to that thing being done, like what happens? Like how does it go from A to B? Where does it stop? Like where does it take more time and less time? What problems are engineers facing when delivering things? Maybe the problem is quality and the work comes back because there's bugs. Maybe they're getting stuck because designs are never ready, and then you have to like go back and forth with design, like with designers, or maybe the product requirements are not clear. Like, kind of really become an expert on the problem, on the, like the delivery end to end. And I think once you do that, if you observe that enough, then you know where to act, right? Because it's a lot of times it's quite in your face, right? If you look at a team and you observe a team and you observe a team's work, you say, okay, well, I can see what's happening. Like it's obviously this is a bottleneck, and then I can work on that bottleneck and kind of like try to make it better.
The why is this project late has this deep rooted sort of cultural alignment to understanding engineering and defining the things. It also has this like, okay, let's not analyze the code, but analyze the process around it, which, is sort of just good engineering practice, but it is very different than knowing, than being overly concerned with the, each Jira ticket or the build system or some sort of myopic thing. It's really looking end to end at the whole outcome desired and what that is, and sort of having a very pragmatic approach to that. So hopefully thinking eventually eliminates the first question that we were talking about, and kind of what you were blogging about that I think was just so interesting is, can you get an organization to a place where no one's asking why this is late? Not because everything was on time, but because there's a fundamental understanding of the process and the goals at a different level.
Yeah, and I think maybe like it's not like completely eliminating the question, but when the question is asked, it's not a problem. It's saying like, oh yeah, I mean, maybe the last week was slow because of X, and I know
Right.
why it was low, and I can act on that. And next week is going to be better. It's not like why have we delivered a project in the last 2 years? So
Yeah. Right. Right. Got it.
it's like if it hurts, do it more often, right? Like it's just like if that question is a problem, like then ask it every week, like
Yeah.
so, and
Until
then
you're
like
not. Yeah.
that'll become less of a problem.
That is a painful but probably very true good summary of this. If it's painful, keep asking until you don't have to anymore. Hey, thank you so much for your time. It's really a pleasure to meet the person behind some what I think is great content. Hopefully, some folks out there can go follow you online as well. And even if you don't need the readership, it helps keep you accountable to your own thoughts. So that's good in
Oh, I
itself.
definitely need the readership, so that adds. But awesome, thank you.